This is a true paranormal story of the home I lived in from 13 years old. The old homestead, Glencoe, was built in the 1860s by convicts transported to Tasmania for whatever crimes they had been found guilty of back in England. It was a huge old place, big enough that we, a family of 8, only used one half of it. The other half was blocked off and used for storage and the like. No one had lived in the old homestead for a quarter of a century before we had moved in. It wasn't in the best condition as a result, but Dad, a builder, and a stonemason did what needed to be done. But we all knew that we weren't alone in the house. We had guests, or perhaps they considered us guests, since they were there long before we ever moved in. At first, we laughed about Glencoe being haunted, making light of it and treating it as a bit of a joke. Yet we all knew it was very real, even if we did not want to take it seriously. Glencoe had 4 residents, ghostly beings that we knew of. The first 3 was a man we called George, a woman we called Matilda, and a young girl, about 7 years of age, we called Amelia. I'll talk about the 4th shortly. We assumed George, Matilda, and Amelia were the family who built the house. The graves of the original owners were on the property, not far from the home. We didn't experience so many things often, seen in claimed ghost videos. There were no slamming of doors, no flickering lights, no moving curtains or any other things so often shown in ghost videos today. Only occasionally did we hear knocking within the walls. Even then, it was only in one area of the house, an old sunroom. We did, however, hear strange noises like footsteps, and often felt as if someone or something was watching. Things moved on their own, or went missing, only to turn up in the most unusual places. About 6 months after we moved in, George, Matilda, and Amelia decided to make themselves known. They weren't just ghostly faces peeking around corners either. They were full-bodied appearances, standing in the hall or lounge or by the kitchen door. The child Amelia was often seen running around the house as if playing. All were always in 19th century clothing, and George, who we and visitors saw the most, always had his black top hat on. Yet the house never had a bad feeling about it. To the contrary, there was a friendly warmth within that house. Of course, that doesn't mean the ghosts didn't scare the bejesus out of us and visitors when they decided to appear. We grew used to living with them, however, and lived there for more than a decade. And all that time, George, Matilda, and Amelia never felt hostile. Rather, they seemed to be more curious than anything else, and seemed happy to have us living there with them. It made it hard to have guests though. More than one person entered the house only to run out and refuse to ever enter again. Many a skeptic also left our house completely converted into a believer. The 4th entity was a different matter entirely. I say entity because I don't know what the 4th was. It was not the same as the other 3, and it certainly was not friendly. While Matilda, George, and Amelia would appear where and whenever they pleased throughout the house, the 4th seemed to be confined to one particular room, a bedroom shared by my older sister and I. We called this entity Thing. Who or what it is, I still don't know, but Thing was utterly terrifying. And all the time we lived at Glencoe, no one ever saw Thing, yet we knew it was there. Even during the day, when the sun streaming through the large window, chasing all the shadows out, the room was a bad place. Whatever inhabited the room was something nobody wanted anything to do with. The nights were the worst. It seemed strange to say a ghost or other entity breathes. After all, they're otherworldly beings and have no need to do so. Yet, it's the only way to describe that the Thing did. Lying in bed at night, my sister and I could hear Thing's heavy breathing, as it literally filled the room. It sounded as if it had been running. Unseen eyes bored into us as we lay in bed, trying very hard to pretend that it was nothing more than our imaginations. We could pretend all we liked, however. There was no doubt whatsoever that thing existed in that particular room, and it had no intentions of going anywhere. It also seems weird to say something we never saw was far scarier than the actual ghostly apparitions of George, Matilda, and Amelia, but it was. We could live with George, Matilda, and Amelia. They meant us no harm, and had no problems with us living in the house with them. That didn't mean they liked everyone who came in the house, though. One time, George seemed to take exception to a group who came to visit. He appeared right in front of the man and his two friends, telling them to get out. The man actually walked through George, who was so close to them. The group let out terrified screams, racing from the house and refusing to ever enter it again. Yet George and his family seemed to like us, and we never felt any hostility from them. The sounds of ghostly parties in the living room, things often going missing, the other weird sounds and strange occurrences in the house weren't bad. After living there for a while, we got used to it. But nobody ever got used to Thing. Who or whatever inhabited that bedroom was utterly terrifying and came from hell itself. Of that, we were sure. One didn't have to see or even hear it to know that. One could just feel the moment one entered that room. What was it? Another ghost who, unlike George, Matilda, and Amelia, was angry for some reason. Perhaps his life was cut short somehow, and he resented it. Perhaps he was an evil bugger, even in life, and remained that way in death. Or maybe Thing was something else entirely. A demon, perhaps. One time, my brother and his friend decided to use a Ouija board to find out. They claimed to have contacted a convict spirit who called himself Rabbit. What he'd done back in England to end up a convict transported to Tasmania was never discovered, but he was apparently hung on the property for murdering someone. My brother and his friend were only young at the time when they contacted Rabbit. It was never ascertained if their claims were true or if it was something they'd simply made up, although my brother, to this day, insists it really happened. Was Rabbit the Thing living in that room, angry because he'd been executed? Perhaps it was the person he murdered who was angry because he'd been killed. Even if the claims of my brother and his friend are true, and they really did contact a spirit named Rabbit, I personally don't think Rabbit, or his victim for that matter, was the entity we called Thing. Whatever inhabited the bedroom was pure evil, and unlike George, Matilda, and Amelia, we were in no doubt that Thing would do harm to us if it could. Some nights, it felt as if Thing was leaning right over me as I lay in bed, too scared to move. My sister had the same experiences, and so did others who spent a night in that room. One evening, I walked into the bedroom and stopped as the hairs on my neck stood straight up as something gave a gruff chuckle. It was pure evil, and felt as if someone or something was right there behind me. When I got enough courage to turn, there was nothing there. I knew that it was Thing. I heard that awful chuckle before during the night. A part of me wanted Thing to appear, just so I could see what it was. The bigger part of me, though, didn't want to know, fearing what I might see. I was about 18 at the time. I'm in my 40s now, but to this day, I remember the feeling of the Thing and that chuckle. Some years later, we discovered an 8-year-old girl died in that room after falling into the fireplace and sustaining severe burns. Was it the little blonde-haired ghost child we called Amelia? We never found out, but assumed it was. Was Thing somehow connected to the death? Who knows? I only know that the Thing lived in the room and was pure evil. We left Glencoe after Dad's sudden death in December of 1994. Without his skills as a builder and a stonemason to see to the upkeep of the house, it was impossible to keep it in livable condition. It was just too big and too old. We said goodbye to George, Matilda, and Amelia in mid-1995. No one has lived in that house since, although I hear the current owners of the property want to renovate the old house and turn it into a hotel and conference center. I have no doubt that George, Matilda, and Amelia still live there, and I'm sure Thing is still there in that bedroom as well. If the old place is turned into a hotel and conference center, I wonder what the ghost of Glencoe will think about it. So, a word of warning. If it does become a hotel, and you should decide to stay there, say hello to George, Matilda, and Amelia for me. If they like you, you'll feel welcome there. If they don't, well, all I can say is that you'll know all about it, and it's unlikely you'll ever be able to game enough to stay there again. As for Thing, if you stay in that first bedroom on the left, next to what was originally an old sunroom, you'll quickly know what I'm talking about when you realize you are sharing your room with a terrifying entity. Are you game enough to stay in a room inhabited by something from hell? I would go back. Despite Thing, I love that old place, and I hope to one day return. If I do, I hope I see the ghost of Glencoe one last time. A part of me still wants to know what Thing is and why it's there. I was in my mid-20s when we left the house, and still, after all these years, I wonder about Thing. It was terrifying, yet strangely fascinating entity, but I'm not sure I'd have the courage to face Thing. It's easy to say I would, while not at the house, but to go back into that room would be a different matter entirely. I still remember the feeling of pure evil and terror in that room. It's not something one forgets, believe me. I firmly believe that even now. If Thing had the power to kill somebody, it would.